Well, hello everybody and welcome to another episode, and today we're going to have a look at a very compact, very capable little camera from Sony, and it's this one, the Sony Nex. This is a very powerful, very capable little camera. I think it's probably been overshadowed a little bit by its bigger brothers, the Sony NEX7 and the A6000, both of which have 24 megapixel sensors as against the NEX6's 16 megapixels. So this is a 16 megapixel camera, but really that's all anybody will ever need unless you're blowing up enormous images to the size of a house. 16 megapixels is more than enough for anybody. It is a really nice camera and it's very well worth a look if you want to dip a toe into the waters of mirrorless photography, especially as they're so cheap at the moment. I bought this one with a lens, this lens, for £200, and really that is quite a bargain. It'll shoot all the Sony E-mount lenses plus pretty much any vintage lens ever made because it's a mirrorless camera. There are one or two exceptions, but pretty much this camera will shoot any lens ever made. So before we go out and shoot, let's have a closer look at this lovely little machine. So there's our little Sony Nex6, and you know, the first thing that struck me when I held this camera was how nicely made it is. This is a very nicely made, very solid feeling machine. I don't know to what extent its components, that is the body components, are plastic or metal, but kind of sounds like metal, but it may well be plastic, I'm not sure. But it's certainly a very nicely made camera and it feels nicely made as well. If we look at the top deck, we can see we've got a conventional PASM dial on here. I've got it set to to aperture priority at the moment because that's the mode I shoot in the most. And then just beneath that ring is the camera's one control wheel, which is configured to change aperture in aperture priority and shutter speed during shutter priority. There are various controls on the back, although they don't use words to denote their functions in the main. There's a lot of symbols. So this one here is playback. It's a little square. This is the menu button, not labelled. I found these buttons quite confusing. We've got auto exposure lock right there, which is very handy, just where you need it. We've got the four-way control wheel here, and each of those four positions brings up a dedicated feature. This button here is for the pop-up flash, which is a nice little feature, nice handy little feature to have on a camera. You can't angle this one upwards though, apart from holding it with your finger, as you can on the XE1 that we looked at a little while ago. But nevertheless, that's a useful thing, and it's there. The viewfinder, it's an electronic viewfinder, and this is one of the few Nex models with an EVF. The 3 and the 5 don't have one, and that really does make it difficult in bright light. But here we've got an EVF, and it's on the left hand side of the camera. So this is a rangefinder style camera, if you like. We can loosely call it that. It's got an articulating screen which folds both downwards and upwards, but unfortunately doesn't flip around to the front. The only tricky bit I've found using the camera is the fact that it does just have this one control wheel, and many of the other settings are on menus. So ideally I think it could do with another control wheel, but having said that, it didn't really present me with any problems in day-to-day photography. So this is a very powerful, very well made, very likeable little camera that I think is really a bit of an unsung gem. But what's it like to use? Well, I've been out and about shooting it for the past week or so, so let's go and see how I got on. This is a great little camera. It's really light. It's really not a big thing. It's the kind of camera you can take around with you all day and really not notice it. I think it might even be a little bit smaller than the Fujifilm X-E1 that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. But whatever the case, it's a very small camera and it's a take anywhere camera as well. However, lenses do add some bulk, and that's whether they're modern or vintage. Let me show you what I mean. So this is the lens we've got on the camera at the moment. It's the kit lens that originally came with the camera from Sony, and as you can see, it's a fairly large lens. And also when you want to extend it, when you want to go to the long end, it extends and it becomes even larger. So this is not the world's smallest lens by any means. It's a sharp lens and it's got really good colour, and as well as being really good for street portraits, it's a great lens for general everyday photography as well. It's very wide at the wide end, it's long enough at the long end to make this a really versatile optic, but as you'll note, it is quite a large one. Now, this camera is really good for shooting vintage lenses, and it excels at that because it's got really good focus peaking. It's very prominent, you can see it very clearly in any lighting conditions. It's got a low and a high setting. It's also importantly got a choice of 3 colours, red, yellow or white, and those are vital because you're going to meet situations where a light colour isn't going to work. You're going to meet situations where a dark peaking colour isn't going to work. This one has a choice between those two, so it's really good for shooting vintage lenses. Actually, I've got to say, I think the peaking on the Sony cameras is pretty much the best that I've tried. Olympus are okay. Fuji, certainly on the later models, the X-T2 onwards, are pretty good. Not so good for the earlier models, and especially the X-E1 really didn't have good peaking. I may be doing Canon mirrorless cameras a disservice because I haven't tried any of those yet, but certainly out of Olympus, Fujifilm and Sony have the best peaking system, and it makes this a really good camera for shooting vintage lenses on. So right now I've got on here the Leica Summitar 50mm f2. That's an L39 lens. It's a rangefinder lens, so the adapter here is very small. So actually with this lens on it, it really looks good. It's actually really nicely proportioned, and rangefinder lenses, certainly in terms of proportions, suit this camera really well. However, if you were to put an SLR lens on there, the adapter would probably extend to about this point here, and then the lens would be sitting on the camera. So that's going to bring it forward to about here, and that does make for a fairly large combination. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does make it a fairly large rig with SLR lenses fitted to it. So this camera has what you might loosely call a rangefinder style, in that the EVF is at the left hand corner there, right on the left hand corner of the body, and actually that's a configuration that I rather like, and I do find it very usable. The EVF itself has good resolution. I'm not sure exactly what the resolution is. I don't suppose it's as high as the later cameras, but it's certainly fit for the purpose, and I've had no problem at all using it. And importantly, this camera does have a diopter control for the EVF, which I consider vital, and I can never understand it when camera manufacturers leave it out. So well done, Sony. We all have different kinds of eyesight, and that needs to be catered for. So I was very glad to see that on this camera. Now, there is only one control wheel on this camera, and that is located just below the PASM dial here on the user's right, and it runs concentric with that dial. It's not caused too much of a problem. It's set up to use rather to select aperture on aperture priority and shutter speed in shutter priority. And as I say, I've not found it too much of a problem while using the camera. The four-way control wheel on the back brings up some of the most useful things like ISO, exposure compensation, shooting mode, and so on. I do miss that dedicated exposure comp dial. It's not been too much of a problem. You can bring it up electronically, dial in the exposure comp you want, and then take your shot. But the only problem is it disappears after you've taken that shot. It doesn't stay on the screen. So if you want to do any more adjustments, you've then got another click to bring up that exposure compensation once again. This method works fine, although it's just a little slower than most other cameras that we've looked at. There is a function button as well, and that can be allocated to bring up any function that you want. But given that there aren't so many controls on this camera, you are going to have to do a little bit of menu diving for certain functions. And it does have the older style of menu. Most of the later Sony cameras from the A7 onwards have the newer style of menu, but this one has the older one, and it's said by some users not to be particularly easy to navigate. I haven't found that. I've found it very simple, very easy. Everything's where you'd expect to find it, and I really haven't had any problems at all with the menu system, despite a lot of online comments saying how difficult it is to use. I don't find it any more difficult than the system on my Sony A7. There's all the swans, Mummy Swan, all the little baby swans. I'm sorry, swans, I've got nothing to give you to eat. I can tell you all about the Sony Nex 6, but I can't give you anything to eat. Image quality from this camera is outstanding. I've absolutely no complaints in the image quality department. It has 16 megapixels, which doesn't sound a lot by today's standards, and it isn't a lot by today's standards, but it's more than enough, and it's really all anyone's ever likely to need. If you want more, then the Nex 7, NEX7 has 24 megapixels, the A7 also has 24 megapixels, as I believe the A6000 does as well, but you certainly won't find yourself lacking in megapixels if you choose this camera. There are more than enough to cover anybody's shooting needs. I love the colours the camera makes. I've made a few shots in the standard colour setting, and on that setting actually the colours are rather like the classic chrome preset of the Fujifilm cameras, which I and many others love so much. They really are quite similar, certainly in the strong light that I was shooting in. The vivid setting pumps up colours, and that's a kind of photography that I love. I love pumped up colours, I love strong saturation, and this camera will deliver it to you on the vivid setting. Absolutely no problem at all. I know this is a bit of an old chestnut, but I do think that the colours, certainly in standard, have something of a filmic quality. They're not unlike the way that film used to render images, so that can only be a good thing. So there are the various standard settings like standard, vivid, black and white, and so on, and then there's a whole bunch of toy settings or sort of fun settings, pop art, watercolor, high contrast black and white, which I actually like that one a lot. That works really nicely. Most of them I don't bother with, but they're a bit of fun if you want them, and they'll add a little bit of sparkle to an image if that's the way you want to go. So what's it like to use? Well, really good actually. I've had a fine old time with this camera. It's lightweight, it's very simple and easy to carry around. It's simple and easy to use if you're not a particularly advanced photographer, or if you want to use the manual settings or aperture priority, shutter priority, those are there as well. It's substantially cheaper than an A6000 or an NEX7. Both those cameras come in at around about £300 body only, whereas I bought this camera for £200 with a lens, and I think that's real good value. So great to use, very simple, very easy to get the most out of if you want to go a little bit more complex, and very cheap as well. This camera has a lot to recommend it. Now, I've looked at 3 digital mirrorless cameras recently on the channel. There was the Olympus EM10, and that was a lovely camera with fantastic colours, but not great in the focus peaking department. Usable, but not fantastic. There was the Fujifilm X-E1, which makes absolutely unique film-like images. I've never quite seen anything like them, but it has awful peaking, which is a shame because it's nicer in many ways than this camera, but that focus peaking really lets it down, and it's not a great camera to use with vintage lenses. I reckon this one is the best all-rounder, especially if you want to shoot vintage lenses as well. I like the EM10 and I love the XE1, but this, for the reasons I've outlined, is the one I would keep. It's small and light, it makes absolutely fantastic images, and I've had a load of fun using it. If you're looking for a competent, powerful mirrorless camera at an affordable price, this one should most definitely be on your list. I've really enjoyed using this little camera. It's very capable, it's very powerful, it's very competent, and it's very likable as well. It's a bit of a rare bird. I don't think they were made for very long, maybe 2-3 years, something like that. And this little one did tend to get overshadowed by the NEX7, which was the sort of top NEX of the day with 24 megapixels and I think an extra control wheel. But don't overlook this one. These are really nice cameras. They make really good colours. A little different, I think, from later Sony sensors in that they're a bit more filmic. And they're very cheap at the moment too. If you want a decent mirrorless camera that will shoot pretty much any lens you can imagine, or if you just want to dip a toe into the waters of mirrorless, you really could do a lot worse than one of these, especially considering the price. Don't forget, these go for around £200 for a body and a lens, so really that's a serious bargain in terms of digital mirrorless cameras. If you're looking for a good mirrorless camera, then you certainly won't go wrong with one of these. So that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the jolly old bell before you go. And if you like the content on this channel and you'd like to support it and help it grow and develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that from as little as $1 per month. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.